The bullet that struck Maximilien Robespierre shattered his jaw in such a brutal manner that fragments of bone would fall from his mouth with every attempt to speak. For a harrowing 14 hours, this influential figure who had orchestrated the execution of 17,000 people by 1792 lay incapacitated. Grappling with the consequences of his own actions, Robespierre had long believed that anyone who opposed his vision for France was nothing less than an enemy of the people. Dissenters were deemed corrupt, and those who advocated for mercy were labeled traitors to the revolutionary cause. In April 1793, he established the Committee of Public Safety, and within just 6 months, he had transformed it into what became the most formidable apparatus of death and terror in European history. Each morning, the committee convened at 9 a.m. in a chamber overlooking the Seine River, and by 10 a.m., they had already determined who would die that day. The statistics were staggering. Between September 1793 and July 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal condemned 2,639 individuals to death in Paris alone, while an additional 1,880 were executed in Lyon and 282 in Toulon, in NCMs, in a macabre twist of efficiency. Prisoners were loaded onto barges and sunk into the Lire River because guillotines could not manage the sheer volume of executions. The bodies drifted downstream for weeks, swollen and unrecognizable, washing up along the banks as far as 32 kilometers away. Pervasive complaints about the unbearable stench reached local officials from towns that had never seen a single revolutionary soldier. Robespierre meticulously documented each execution, maintaining reports that detailed names, ages, occupations, and alleged offenses with the precision of an accountant. A baker who charged too much for bread, guillotined. A priest who refused to pledge allegiance to the state, guillotined. A woman who voiced her concerns about food shortages, guillotined. A 14-year-old boy who shouted, "Long live the king," during a street scuffle, guillotined. An elderly nobleman who could not walk to the scaffold on his own, requiring assistance, guillotined. A pregnant woman who pleaded for her life until after her child was born, executed on the same day her desperate request was denied. Each morning, guards read from Robespierre's lists to the prisoners crammed into cells designed for half their capacity. The condemned were transported on wooden carts through streets thronged with people who hurled trash, stones, and even human waste at them. The trip from the prison to the scaffold took a precise 45 minutes. At the Place de la Executioner, Charles Henry Sanson would position each victim beneath the guillotine with grim efficiency. A countdown of 10 would begin, the blade would drop, and the severed head would drop into a wicker basket. The body would then be unceremoniously tossed into a mass grave filled with quicklime. Although Robespierre rarely attended these executions in person, he immersed himself in detailed reports about them, kept a journal, cataloging not only the names of those he had condemned, but also noting their final words, behaviors at the scaffold, and their perceived remorse for their alleged crimes. When former Queen Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16, 1793, he wrote that her composure was evidence of her failure to grasp the suffering of the French populace. Similarly, he commented on the case of his former ally Georges Danton, who was executed on April 5, 1794, noting that Danton's pleas for mercy revealed his deep-seated corruption. By early 1794, Robespierre was sleeping only 3 hours a night, plagued by a nervous twitch that made his left eye blink uncontrollably during speeches. He withdrew from public appearances, save for official events, and when he spoke, his voice had taken on a high-pitched, shrill quality. Many members observed that he began to speak only during meetings, often arguing with imaginary opponents and occasionally laughing at jokes unheard by others. Witnesses, including the daughter of his landlord, testified that they often heard him pacing in his room until dawn, rehearsing speeches to empty chairs. Robespierre became increasingly paranoid, carrying a loaded pistol with him everywhere, even depositing it on the table next to his papers during discussions. His handwriting, once orderly and precise, deteriorated into a chaotic scrawl. Riddled with ink stains from pressing too hard, words scrawled out multiple times, and margins filled with nonsensical notes. In his private journal, he obsessively repeated the phrase, "The Republic of Virtue will triumph, sometimes writing it as many as 50 times on a single page. Under his new laws, trials could be concluded in as little as 15 minutes. Accused individuals were prohibited from having legal representation, and the only verdicts possible were acquittal or death. Following the implementation of these laws, executions tripled, jumping from 5 per day to 15. However, this was a step too far for many members of the National Convention, who realized that their own lives were at stake if they did not act against him. Joseph Paul Barras and June Lambert Tallien clandestinely gathered at Barras' apartment to orchestrate what they termed the necessary action. They recognized they had one opportunity. Failure meant that Robespierre would have them all executed within 24 hours. If they succeeded, they might end the reign of terror. Their plan was straightforward. Convince enough members of the convention that Robespierre intended to arrest them all, and then move more swiftly than he could react. On July 27, 1794, the day commenced like any other during the Reign of Terror. Robespierre arose at 5 a.m., read reports from provincial committees, and began to prepare a speech defending his policies, oblivious to the fact that 43 members of the convention had secretly signed an agreement to denounce him upon his entry. When Robespierre arrived at the convention at noon, dressed in his signature blue coat and powdered wig, he felt assured that he could quell any opposition. With his superior rhetoric and moral standing and ability, he believed had served him well countless times before. However, as he began to speak, an uproar erupted from all corners of the room. For the first time in 3 years, members of the convention no longer felt compelled to suppress their dissent. "Down with the tyrant," someone cried from the back. "You are the enemy of the people," another shouted. As Robespierre attempted to respond, his voice was drowned out by a rhythmic chant, "Death to Robespierre! A death to Robespierre!" The man who had long terrorized France fell silent as his former allies denounced him with the same merciless efficiency he had once wielded against his own adversaries, as the guards moved in to apprehend him. Robespierre appeared genuinely astonished that anyone would dare to confront him. Having grown accustomed to his absolute power, he struggled to comprehend the unfolding events. "Cannot arrest virtue," he protested as the guards seized his arms. "I am the representative of the people." Nevertheless, the representatives of the people dragged him from the room as cheers erupted from the crowds outside. Their jubilant voices echoing 6 blocks away, Robespierre was taken to Luxembourg prison. But the warden refused to admit him out of fear of housing such a dangerous prisoner. The guards then transported him to the conciergerie, where Marie Antoinette had spent her final days. But the officials there also declined his entry. For 3 excruciating hours, the guards led Robespierre from prison to prison, as he insisted that his arrest was unlawful and that he should be allowed to speak with the Committee of Public Safety. Ultimately, they brought him to the Hôtel de Ville, where his brother Augustin and his most loyal supporters had gathered in a desperate attempt to stage a rescue. Inside, Robespierre penned what he believed would be his final speech of fervent defense of his actions intended to rally the citizens of Paris to his cause. He was convinced that once the public grasped the situation, they would rise up against his enemies, just as they had against the king. However, when Robespierre supporters attempted to march on the convention, they found the streets largely deserted. The sans-culottes, who had once fervently followed him, stayed home. And the National Guard units dispatched to disperse the meager crowd encountered little resistance. By 2 a.m., it was evident that Robespierre's rescue attempt had utterly failed. The man who had long claimed to speak on behalf of the people discovered that they had finally stopped listening. Around 3 a.m. on July 28th, as convention forces stormed the Hôtel de Ville, shot rang out in the room where Robespierre was drafting his speech. Counts vary. Some witnesses claimed he attempted suicide. Others asserted that a guard accidentally shot him, while some believed it was Charles Murda, a young Jacobin, who deliberately fired at him. What remained consistent was the outcome. The bullet entered through Robespierre's mouth and exited from the left side of his jaw, shattering the bone and rendering him barely able to speak more than a whisper. The injured Robespierre was discovered collapsed on a wooden table. Lying in a pool of his own blood, still conscious but struggling to breathe, a military surgeon, Pierre-François Percy, examined him and found that his jaw was fractured in 3 places and several teeth had been dislodged. Though the wound was not immediately fatal, Someone hastily wrapped his head in bandages torn from a tablecloth, and guards transported him to the headquarters of the Committee of Public Safety, where he would linger for the next 14 hours waiting for death. During those final hours, Robespierre endured the psychological torture he had inflicted upon countless others. He faced the grim certainty of death without any knowledge of when it would come. He sat in the very chair where he had previously signed death warrants for friends, enemies and strangers alike, unable to communicate clearly due to the extent of his injuries, while the sounds of his former colleagues celebrating his downfall echoed from the next room. Periodically someone would check on him, usually to inquire if he wished to share any final thoughts or confess his supposed transgressions against the French people. Yet whenever he attempted to reply, only blood and incoherent sounds escaped his lips. News of Robespierre's impending execution rapidly swept through Paris, and by 6 a.m., the populace was already vying for the best vantage points to witness the spectacle at the guillotine. Street vendors hawked bread, wine, and pastries to the onlookers, who regarded the event with jubilation rather than morbid curiosity. Children pretended to be Robespierre, enacting their own mock executions, while women knitted as they waited for the inevitable. But this crowd was unlike any previous assembly. They were not merely bloodthirsty spectators. They were individuals who had endured the terror for 16 long months, finally liberated to openly express their pent-up animosity. People exchanged stories of friends and family members who had fallen victim to the terror, comparing experiences of loss and sharing tales of how Robespierre's policies had devastated their lives. Some even carried portraits of relatives who had been executed, brandishing them as defiant banners. Others brought makeshift effigies of Robespierre to incinerate following the execution. Street musicians performed songs that mocked the fallen dictator, while amateur poets recited verses lamenting his demise. Prostitutes offered their services for free to anyone who could recount a convincing story of how Robespierre had personally wronged them. The atmosphere of the city transformed into a vibrant celebration of one man's death. By 4 p.m., guards loaded Robespierre and 21 of his supporters onto the carts designated for the condemned, setting off for the Place de la Journey, which typically took 45 minutes, stretched nearly 2 hours as crowds obstructed the streets, showering the prisoners with insults and other objects. "There goes the monster," the people shouted. "Look at the tyrant now." Others serenaded the procession with revolutionary songs. Their lyrics now turned to ridicule Robespierre's downfall. Children ran beside the cart seeking opportunities to spit on or strike the prisoners with sticks. Robespierre's bandages were drenched in blood, his signature blue coat torn and stained. His once pristine white wig had vanished, leaving his hair gray from months of sleepless paranoia. Unable to hold his head high due to his shattered jaw, he slumped forward, chin resting against his chest, glancing at the crowd without making direct eye contact. The man who had once commanded silence with a single gesture was now merely another broken prisoner en route to the guillotine. Upon finally reaching the scaffold, the volume of the crowd was so overwhelming that guards had to shout into each other's ears to communicate. It was estimated that 200,000 people swarmed into every accessible space: windows, rooftops, balconies, and lampposts. Some spectators had paid exorbitant sums for places with better views, while others climbed trees or stood on one another's shoulders. The atmosphere was unlike any other execution during the Revolution. Instead of cold, bloodthirsty anticipation, the throng radiated pure joy and exhilaration. As guards pulled Robespierre from the cart, the crowd erupted in approval, their cheers so thunderous that windows in nearby buildings shattered. The climactic moment arrived when Sanson's assistant tore away the blood-soaked bandages that had shrouded Robespierre's wound for 14 hours. The sudden exposure caused his shattered jaw to swing open, triggering a primal scream that witnesses described as inhuman. For a fleeting few seconds, a profound silence enveloped the crowd, captivated by the visceral agony of the man who had once seemed almost supernaturally powerful. Then, one voice broke the stillness, proclaiming, "That's the scream of all his victims." And the cheers erupted once again, even louder than before. Sanson later noted that the execution itself proceeded flawlessly. The blade fell cleanly, severing Robespierre's head instantly, resulting in immediate death. Yet what unfolded next was unprecedented in the annals of the Revolution. Instead of the customary brief cheer that usually followed a beheading, the masses erupted into raucous celebration that persisted for hours. People danced in the streets, sang jubilant songs, embraced strangers, and shared wine. Street vendors capitalized on the atmosphere, selling souvenirs they claimed contained drops of Robespierre's blood or shards from the guillotine. The revelry spiraled into the early hours of the morning, and news of Robespierre's death traveled far and wide, igniting spontaneous celebrations across France. In Lyon, where nearly 1,880 individuals had met their end during the terror. Citizens built bonfires using furniture from executed nobles, throwing effigies of Robespierre into the flames. In Marseille, church bells rang out relentlessly for 6 hours, while ships in the port fired cannons in joyous celebration. In Bordeaux, wine merchants uncorked their finest bottles and distributed them freely to anyone eager to toast the tyrant's demise. The festive sounds of merriment echoed from one end of France to the other, marking the end of an era defined by bloodshed and a fervent hope for a new beginning. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dissolved, and the age of terror that had held France in its vice-like grip began to unravel, giving way to an uncertain yet hopeful future.